The cobblestones of Florence gleamed wet under the autumn rain as made his way through the narrow streets, his footsteps echoing in the empty alleyways. It was 1513, and the man who had once counseled princes now walked in exile, stripped of his position, his influence reduced to the scratching of a quill on parchment in his modest villa. Yet in this solitude, in this forced isolation from the corridors of power, would discover truths that would resonate through the centuries, speaking directly to every soul who has ever found themselves walking alone. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, the author of The Prince, a man who understood better than anyone the mechanics of power and influence, now experiencing firsthand what it meant to be cast out, to walk without the protection of allies, without the comfort of consensus, without the safety of the crowd. But perhaps this was exactly the perspective needed to understand the profound strength that exists in solitude, the unique opportunities that present themselves only to those brave enough to walk their own path. As settled into his study that evening, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across his weathered face, he began to contemplate a truth that would become central to his understanding of human nature and success. That there are moments in every person's life when they must walk alone, and it is precisely in these moments that their true character is revealed and their greatest triumphs are born. The necessity of solitary leadership. The first lesson that emerges from his experience, both as a counselor to princes and as an exile, is that true leadership often requires the courage to stand alone. In his observations of successful rulers throughout history, from Julius Caesar to his contemporary, noted a common thread: the willingness to make decisions that others would find too difficult, too risky, or too unpopular. When you find yourself walking alone, you are not experiencing failure. You are experiencing the natural consequence of thinking independently, of refusing to be carried along by the current of popular opinion, of having the audacity to see possibilities that others cannot or will not acknowledge. Understood that the crowd, by its very nature, is conservative, risk-averse, and quick to abandon those who dare to venture beyond the safety of conventional wisdom. Consider the prince who must decide whether to enter into a war that his advisors fear, or the merchant who invests in a venture that others consider foolish, or the artist who pursues a vision that the public does not yet understand. In each case, the moment of decision is a moment of profound solitude. The responsibility cannot be shared, the consequences cannot be distributed among a committee, and the courage required cannot be borrowed from others. This solitude is not an accident or a misfortune. It is a necessity. For if significant decisions could be made comfortably within the consensus of a group, they would not be significant decisions at all. They would be the obvious choices that anyone could make, requiring no particular insight, courage, or leadership. The very fact that you find yourself alone in your conviction is often the best evidence that your conviction is worth pursuing. Observed this principle repeatedly in his diplomatic missions and his studies of historical figures. The rulers who achieved lasting success were those who understood that leadership is fundamentally a solitary responsibility. They might gather advisors, they might seek counsel, they might build alliances, but when the moment of decision arrived, they stood alone with their choice and its consequences. This understanding extends far beyond formal positions of power. Every individual who has ever achieved something meaningful has experienced the sensation of walking alone. The scientist pursuing a theory that contradicts established doctrine walks alone. The entrepreneur building a business in an untested market walks alone. The artist creating work that challenges conventional aesthetics walks alone. The parent making difficult decisions about their child's future walks alone. The key insight that offers is that this solitude should not be feared or avoided. It should be embraced as a sign that you are operating at the level where real change becomes possible. The crowd can follow, but it cannot lead. The group can provide comfort and validation, but it cannot provide the clarity of vision that comes only to the individual mind, unencumbered by the need to accommodate multiple perspectives and competing interests. When wrote about the lion and the fox, the two natures that a prince must embody, he was describing the dual necessity of strength and cunning. But both the lion and the fox are fundamentally solitary creatures. The lion does not hunt in committee, and the fox does not rely on consensus to navigate threats and opportunities. They trust their instincts, make rapid decisions based on incomplete information, and take full responsibility for the outcomes. This is not to say that the person walking alone should ignore all input from others or refuse all forms of collaboration. Rather, it means understanding that there are certain decisions, certain moments, certain paths that can only be navigated by the individual. It means recognizing that the feeling of isolation that accompanies difficult choices is not a signal to retreat back to the safety of groupthink, but rather a confirmation that you are engaging with challenges worthy of your full capabilities. The history of human progress is written by those who were willing to walk alone. Every significant advancement in science, art, philosophy, technology, and social organization began with an individual who saw something that others did not see, who believed something that others did not believe, who was willing to act on convictions that others did not share. The loneliness they experienced was not a bug in the system, it was a feature. His own life exemplifies this principle. His greatest work, The Prince, was written during his period of political exile, when he had been stripped of his official positions and was persona grata in the circles of power. It was precisely because he was walking alone, because he had been forced outside the comfortable consensus of his former colleagues, that he was able to see clearly the mechanisms of power and influence that those still embedded within the system could not perceive. The manuscript that would become one of the most influential works in political philosophy was born not from a position of strength and connection, but from a position of isolation and apparent weakness. Yet this isolation provided something that no amount of political networking could have provided: the freedom to think without constraint, to observe without obligation, to write without compromise. This pattern repeats throughout history and across disciplines. The breakthrough insights, the revolutionary innovations, the transformative works of art, they emerge from individuals who have the courage to walk alone, to trust their own perception over the collective wisdom of their peers, to risk being wrong in spectacular and public ways rather than being safely invisible in the crowd. When you find yourself walking alone, when the path you have chosen seems to diverge from every other path around you, when friends and family question your decisions and colleagues doubt your judgment, remember that you are in distinguished company. You are walking the same path that every leader, every innovator, every creator has walked before you. The loneliness you feel is not evidence of your mistake, it is evidence of your courage. The strategic advantages of independence. The second profound insight that emerges from philosophy is that walking alone, far from being merely a necessary burden, actually provides significant strategic advantages that are impossible to achieve any other way. While the crowd offers comfort and security, it also imposes constraints and limitations that can prevent the achievement of truly extraordinary outcomes. When analyzed the most successful rulers of his era, he noticed that their greatest victories often came not from following conventional wisdom or building consensus, but from making moves that others considered impossible, inadvisable, or insane. These leaders understood something that their more cautious contemporaries did not: that independence of thought and action creates opportunities that are invisible to those operating within the constraints of group consensus. The first advantage of walking alone is speed. While committees debate and groups seek consensus, the individual can observe, decide, and act with remarkable velocity. In a world where circumstances change rapidly and opportunities have brief windows of availability, this speed can be decisive. Observed that fortune favors not just the bold, but specifically the quick, those who can recognize a moment of opportunity and seize it before others even realize it exists. Consider the merchant who notices a shift in consumer preferences before it becomes obvious to competitors, or the investor who recognizes the potential of a new technology before it gains mainstream acceptance, or the military commander who perceives a momentary weakness in enemy defenses. In each case, the advantage belongs to the person who can act on their individual perception without waiting for validation from others. This speed advantage extends beyond mere tactical considerations. The person walking alone can pivot, adapt, and evolve their strategies without the friction that comes from coordinating multiple viewpoints and interests. They can abandon approaches that are not working, experiment with unconventional methods, and pursue unexpected opportunities without having to justify their decisions to a group or build consensus around changes in direction. The second advantage is clarity of vision. When you are not constantly adjusting your perspective to accommodate the viewpoints of others, when you are not filtering your observations through the lens of group dynamics and political considerations, you can see with remarkable clarity. This is not to say that other perspectives have no value, but rather that there are insights that are only available to the individual mind, operating without the static of competing voices and conflicting agendas. Himself experienced this phenomenon during his years of exile. Removed from the daily pressures of political negotiation and consensus building, he was able to observe the patterns of power and influence with a clarity that had eluded him during his years as an active participant in government. The distance from the system allowed him to see the system more clearly than those still embedded within it. This clarity extends to self-knowledge as well. When you are walking alone, when you are not constantly performing for an audience or adjusting your behavior to meet the expectations of a group, you discover who you actually are beneath the layers of social adaptation and political calculation. This self-knowledge becomes a source of strength and authenticity that cannot be achieved through any amount of external validation or group participation. The third advantage is flexibility. Groups, by their nature, develop momentum, establish patterns, and create expectations that become increasingly difficult to change. The individual walking alone maintains the ability to shift direction rapidly, to abandon strategies that are not working, to pursue opportunities that require quick pivots or unconventional approaches. This flexibility is particularly valuable in environments of high uncertainty and rapid change. While groups tend to rely on established protocols and proven methods, which may be perfectly adequate for stable, predictable situations, the individual can adapt to new circumstances with an agility that larger, more complex organizations cannot match. Noted this principle in his observations of military campaigns, where smaller, more maneuverable forces often defeated larger, more powerful armies through superior flexibility and responsiveness to changing battlefield conditions. The same principle applies in every domain where success requires adaptation to unpredictable circumstances. The fourth advantage is authenticity. When you are not constantly negotiating with others about what should be done or how it should be done, when you are not moderating your approach to accommodate different personalities and preferences, you can operate from a position of complete authenticity. Your decisions reflect your actual values, priorities, and judgments rather than some compromised position that satisfies no one fully. This authenticity becomes a source of power in itself. People can sense the difference between someone who is operating from genuine conviction and someone who is merely representing a consensus position or following a prescribed formula. The person walking alone, operating from authentic conviction, often has a compelling quality that is impossible to replicate through committee-based decision-making. The fifth advantage is the element of surprise. Groups tend to make predictable decisions because they rely on conventional wisdom, established precedents, and widely shared assumptions. The individual walking alone can make moves that others do not anticipate because they are not constrained by the same mental frameworks and social pressures that guide group behavior. This element of surprise can be decisive in competitive situations. Whether in business, politics, warfare, or any other domain where success depends on outmaneuvering opponents, the ability to make unexpected moves provides a crucial advantage. Understood that the ruler who could not be predicted by enemies had already won half the battle. The sixth advantage is complete ownership of outcomes. When you walk alone, when you make your own decisions and implement your own strategies, you own both the successes and the failures completely. This might seem like a disadvantage when things go wrong, but it is actually a source of tremendous power. Complete ownership means complete learning. Every outcome provides direct, unfiltered feedback that can be used to improve future decisions. Groups, by contrast, tend to experience diffused responsibility and ambiguous feedback. When things go well, it is difficult to know which elements of the group approach were responsible for success. When things go poorly, it is difficult to identify the specific causes and make appropriate corrections. The individual walking alone has crystal clear cause and effect relationships that accelerate learning and improvement. The seventh advantage is the absence of internal conflict. Groups inevitably experience internal tensions, competing priorities, and conflicting approaches that consume energy and create friction. The individual walking alone channels all energy toward external challenges and opportunities rather than internal negotiations and politics. This focused allocation of energy and attention can produce extraordinary results. When every decision is aligned, when every action serves a unified purpose, when there is no internal resistance or competing agenda, remarkable things become possible. Observed this principle in successful rulers who maintained clear, unified command structures rather than trying to govern through committees or councils with competing interests. These strategic advantages of independence are not theoretical abstractions. They are practical tools that can be leveraged by anyone willing to embrace the responsibility and risk that comes with walking alone. The key is recognizing that the discomfort of solitude is often the price of access to capabilities that are simply not available to those who remain safely embedded within groups and consensus-based approaches. When wrote about the necessity of a prince being both feared and loved, but if forced to choose, being feared rather than loved, he was describing this fundamental trade-off. The comfortable path of seeking approval and maintaining harmony with others often precludes the difficult decisions and controversial actions that produce exceptional results. The person willing to walk alone, to risk disapproval and isolation, gains access to a range of strategies and capabilities that remain forever closed to those who prioritize comfort and acceptance above effectiveness and achievement. The inner fortress, psychological resilience and self-reliance. The third and perhaps most crucial insight from philosophy concerns the internal transformation that occurs when you truly embrace walking alone. Beyond the strategic advantages and leadership necessities lies something more fundamental: the development of what can only be described as an inner fortress, a psychological resilience and self-reliance that becomes the foundation for all other achievements. Understood both through his studies of historical figures and through his own experience of political exile, that external circumstances are fundamentally unreliable. Allies become enemies, fortunes reverse, popular opinion shifts, and the structures of power that seem permanent can crumble overnight. The person who builds their sense of security and identity on external validation, social approval, or institutional support is building on sand. But the person who learns to walk alone, who develops the capacity to find strength within themselves rather than from their environment, builds something that cannot be taken away by any external force. This inner fortress becomes the source from which all other capabilities flow: the confidence to make difficult decisions, the courage to pursue unpopular paths, the resilience to persist through setbacks, and the clarity to see opportunities that others miss. The construction of this inner fortress begins with the acceptance of responsibility. When you walk alone, when you cannot blame others for your circumstances or depend on others to rescue you from difficulties, you are forced to develop a level of personal responsibility that is rarely achieved by those who remain embedded in supportive groups and structures. This responsibility, initially experienced as a burden, gradually transforms into a source of tremendous personal power. Observed this transformation in successful rulers who had been forced to build their power from nothing, who had experienced betrayal and defeat before achieving victory. These experiences, rather than weakening them, had forged them into leaders of exceptional capability precisely because they had learned to rely primarily on their own judgment, their own resources, and their own determination. The same principle applies to individuals in any context. The entrepreneur who builds a business without external funding develops different capabilities than one who has access to abundant capital from others. The artist who creates without institutional support develops different strength than one who works within established systems. The person who navigates life's challenges without a safety net of family wealth or social connections develops different resilience than one who has always had those supports available. This is not to romanticize hardship or suggest that external support is always negative. Rather, it is to recognize that the experience of walking alone, of being forced to rely on your own resources and judgment, produces capabilities that cannot be developed any other way. These capabilities become permanent assets that remain available even when external circumstances improve. The inner fortress is built through a series of psychological adaptations that occur when you consistently face challenges without external rescue. The first adaptation is the development of emotional self-regulation. When there is no group to provide emotional support, no consensus to validate your feelings, no external authority to blame for difficulties, you must learn to manage your own emotional state. This skill, once developed, provides enormous advantages in all areas of life. The person who can maintain emotional equilibrium in the face of criticism, setbacks, uncertainty, and isolation has access to their full intellectual and creative capabilities even under stress. They can make clear decisions when others are paralyzed by anxiety. They can see opportunities when others are consumed by fear. And they can persist toward long-term goals when others are distracted by immediate emotional concerns. The second adaptation is the development of independent judgment. When you cannot rely on the opinions of others to guide your decisions, When you cannot wait for consensus to emerge or authority figures to provide direction, you must learn to trust your own analysis and intuition. This capacity for independent judgment, initially developed out of necessity, becomes a competitive advantage in every context. The person with well-developed independent judgment can evaluate opportunities and threats without being swayed by popular opinion or expert consensus. They can recognize patterns that others miss, identify assumptions that others take for granted, and make connections that others fail to see. This independence of thought often leads to insights and innovations that would be impossible for someone operating within the constraints of groupthink or conventional wisdom. The third adaptation is the development of self-motivation. When there is no external system of rewards and punishments to guide your behavior, no peer pressure to maintain your efforts, no institutional structure to provide momentum, you must learn to generate your own motivation from internal sources. This self-motivation becomes a renewable resource that is not dependent on external circumstances. The person who has developed genuine self-motivation can pursue long-term goals even when progress is slow and recognition is absent. They can maintain high standards even when no one is watching, and they can persist through difficulties even when others would abandon the effort. This internal drive often produces results that seem extraordinary to those who depend on external motivation, but which feel natural and sustainable to the person operating from internal sources. The fourth adaptation is the development of creative problem-solving abilities. When you cannot rely on established protocols, expert advice, or group brainstorming to solve problems, when you must figure things out for yourself using whatever resources are available, you develop a level of creative problem-solving capability that is rarely achieved by those who have access to extensive external support. This creativity extends beyond specific technical skills to include a general capacity for resourcefulness and innovation. The person who has learned to walk alone develops the ability to see solutions where others see only obstacles, to find resources where others see only limitations, and to create opportunities where others see only constraints. The fifth adaptation is the development of strategic thinking. When you are solely responsible for your own success or failure, when you cannot rely on others to handle long-term planning and strategic considerations, you must develop the ability to think strategically about your goals, resources, and approaches. This strategic thinking becomes a fundamental skill that applies to every area of life. The person who thinks strategically can see beyond immediate circumstances to understand long-term patterns and consequences. They can make short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. They can position themselves advantageously for future opportunities, and they can avoid traps and dead ends that ensnare those who think only tactically or. The sixth adaptation is the development of what called a combination of skill, courage, and excellence that enables a person to shape circumstances rather than merely react to them. Is not virtue in the moral sense, but rather a practical excellence that emerges from the combination of all the other adaptations developed through walking alone. The person who has developed has the capability to influence their environment rather than simply adapting to it. They can create opportunities rather than merely waiting for them. They can solve problems rather than merely enduring them. And they can achieve goals that others consider impossible rather than settling for what others consider realistic. These psychological adaptations, developed through the experience of walking alone, create a foundation of personal power that is immune to external circumstances. The person who possesses this inner fortress may still choose to collaborate with others, to seek advice and support, to build alliances and relationships. But they do so from a position of strength rather than need, from choice rather than dependency. This distinction is crucial. The person who engages with others from a position of strength brings more to every relationship and collaboration. They contribute more value, they make better partners, and they create more successful outcomes precisely because they are not needy or dependent. Their independence becomes a gift they can share rather than a weakness that must be compensated for by others. His own life demonstrates this principle. His years of political exile, his experience of walking alone through personal and professional wilderness, transformed him from a competent but unremarkable civil servant into one of history's most influential political philosophers. The insights that emerged from his solitude have shaped human understanding of power, leadership, and human nature for over 500 years. The inner fortress that he built during those years of isolation became the foundation for contributions that would have been impossible to make from within the comfortable constraints of institutional life. The very experience that seemed like failure, his exile from political power, became the source of his greatest and most enduring success. When you find yourself walking alone, when the path seems difficult and the destination uncertain, when others question your choices and circumstances seem to conspire against you, remember that you are engaged in the most important work of human development, the construction of your inner fortress. Every challenge you face without external rescue, every decision you make without group consensus, every step you take in solitude adds another stone to the foundation of capabilities that will serve you for the rest of your life. The loneliness is temporary, but the strength is permanent. The isolation is circumstantial, but the self-reliance is foundational. The difficulty is momentary, but the resilience is lasting. In learning to walk alone, you are not just surviving a difficult period, you are building the psychological infrastructure that will support every future achievement, every meaningful relationship, and every significant contribution you will make to the world. This is the ultimate wisdom that offers to those who find themselves walking alone, that the experience, far from being a punishment or a failure, is actually the most direct path to the development of human capabilities and potential. The inner fortress built through solitude becomes the foundation from which all other successes are possible, the source from which all other strengths flow, and the bedrock upon which a life of meaning and impact can be built. In the end, everyone walks alone. The choice is whether to embrace this reality and use it to build strength, or to resist it and remain forever dependent on circumstances and other people for security and direction. Writing by candlelight in his exile, choosing to embrace his solitude rather than merely endure it, shows us the path toward the transformation of isolation into independence, loneliness into strength, and adversity into advantage. The road may be empty, but it leads to destinations that can only be reached by those brave enough to walk it. The journey may be solitary, but it develops capabilities that can only be forged in the crucible of individual responsibility and self-reliance. The path may be difficult, but it is the only path that leads to the full realization of human potential and the achievement of truly extraordinary outcomes. If you are walking alone, you are exactly where you need to be.